Record the video now, so I'm going to mute everybody and we'll go with our normal presentation for now. So I'm going to mute everyone and I hope you enjoyed today's session. As I said, unfortunately, Ryan Muir's internet connection is failing in Newcastle. So you have the privilege of listening to me ramble on for another, hopefully 20 minutes or so, but knowing me it's going to be 30 minutes or so. Good morning, Ian, how are you?
Good morning, Gil.
I'm going to mute you all now. Here we go. No, that's fine. Okay. Whoops. So again, good morning, everybody. I'm about to share my screen and we'll commence the session this morning. So we'll share that and we'll get ourselves rolling. So I hope everyone can see that screen. Chris, I think you can see it. So send me a text, Chris, if you can't see the screen. So 20th of May, good morning, everybody. Everything's improving, obviously, and it's rather exciting that we're not far off seeing the return of things to normal. Sorry, I'm just checking here. Yep. It looks like there's a lot of positive about to happen, but of course the story of the day is China and the tariffs they're putting on Australia. So I'm going to do a bit of analysis of that at the back end. But to start with this morning, I'm going to present Ryan Muir's slides, which is really the virus update and the market update. So we'll get into that just now. So same agenda as before, a bit of a recap on things. I'm going to look at China versus Australia because it's all the media is going to be talking about for the next week or so. Again, I suspect it's going to be a storm in the teacup, primarily because of China's previous behaviour and their need for Australia. We'll just look at it though when we get to that point. So just general housekeeping. We were targeting 15 minutes, but I don't think a single one of these has been under 25, so we're going to do our best. If you've got any questions, please click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any difficulty with sound, turn your video off and that should improve your sound. We're going to make it, we're going to record the video as per normal and we'll email the link out to you. And I know a lot of people have been looking at it and it's rather humbling to think that you're still tuning in after all these weeks. So we wanted to say thank you, and while ever you're finding it valuable, we'll continue to talk. As always, today's conversation is general advice in nature. It's not meant to be specific to any one client. Try to make it as absolutely relevant as possible. If there are any questions or issues that appear as a result of today's conversation, please get in contact with us individually and we'll address those with you. So previous webinars, everything's available on request. We've talked about the government stimulus. It's so successful that we're talking about winding it back now. Economic indicators are quite strong. The financial indicators that are all around the world are suggesting quite strong recovery in things. Reserve Bank economic outlook, we've covered that. Looking towards, we're going to have a choppy year or two as we go through this. I suspect we're going to start to see a positive market over the next few months as the world kind of returns to normal. Then we're going to see the unemployment figures coming through, particularly in the young people, and that'll result in a flat spot. My gut instinct is around Christmas time. Hopefully by this time next year, we should see the government stimulus measures really kicking in, and that should result in stronger market recovery going forward. Certainly has in every case in the past. Quick update on the market. Looking at the cases 2 weeks ago, there were 6,800 cases, now there's 7,000, so a couple of hundred more cases in 2 weeks. We've lost 4 more people and most people have recovered. The curve is well and truly flat and it's now down in the single digit reoccurrences on a daily basis. If we look here at the figures on the 4th of May on the left, there were 28 new cases in the week. This week there's 12. There were 70 in hospital 2 weeks ago, now there's 45. There were 650,000 tests 2 weeks ago and there's been 1 million. So the reality is it is under control in this country, and I don't think there's going to be much resistance to the notion of returning life to normal in this country, which means domestic tourism and probably tourism to New Zealand. There will be some interesting discussions around whether and when we should open up the borders and allow people from other countries to come in, because they can't be certain of the control mechanisms of other nations, whereas we have a very high degree of confidence in ours. One thing that I do know, though, is it's been a delight that we haven't had the clogging up of the hospitals that they had in America. But we're now certainly down to the case, I believe, that there are actually 7 people in intensive care in the entire country. So that's how small a problem this is, which is great. First stage of restriction has been starting to ease. So my kids are going back to school next week. I presume the kids and grandkids are as well. We'll be looking at returning to normal in over the next 6 weeks, but it should be quicker than that for most practical people. Time will tell. They'll be watching for new infections like a hawk, but when there's only 45 cases in the country, the chance of that, 45 really sick people in the country, the chance of that reinfecting nationally is quite slim. As 11 new cases reported nationwide on Monday, 8 from Victoria, and that's a cluster based around McDonald's. So we're not getting many new cases at all. It really means that everything's under control. Next week, numbers will be telling. This is the graph we've been putting up every week. It's starting to look very, very similar now. We're seeing France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. We've got nice flatlining going on. The one thing that I talked about a few weeks ago, and I'll probably backtrack on my position a couple of weeks ago to a certain extent. Sweden was the one country in the world that chose not to mandate, one of the very few countries in the world that chose not to put enforced restrictions on the population. And the Swedish death rate is actually the highest death rate per person in Europe. So by one measure, which is the health outcomes, you could suggest that clamping down on the country like Australia and New Zealand and Japan, Korea and China have done, has actually been the best outcome. The impact on the economy is going to tell over the next year or two, but we will see as that goes in. It's just been an interesting observation that Sweden's more relaxed approach, their laissez-faire approach, has resulted in more illness than any other part or more negative outcomes than any other country in Europe, and that's a big statement. World situation: 4.6 million cases, 93,000 cases in the week. We've lost 312,000 people. Early comments I made about this being a case of the flu, I think, to be honest, I was understating it. This is 300,000 people dead with all the measures put in place that they've put in place around the world. If we didn't have those measures, we'd be seeing a genuine catastrophe in the millions now. So I think by any measure we can rate this as a very, very serious outbreak that was not the equivalent of a nasty flu. It's probably a bit worse. But the delightful thing is that the figures in the Pacific area are the best in the world. So all around the world, people are relaxing restrictions, isolation fatigue, some relapses seen in Singapore. Singapore has a problem with migrant workers that in many ways are the untouchables in Singapore. They don't get reported on. South Korea's had a few little issues going forward. We're searching all around for the vaccines. There's certainly some early promising results around the world. In the US, it depends on who you talk to, but it does take 12 months to get a vaccine tested and out there. We might see some stuff coming out earlier than that. The chloroquine story with Donald Trump and so forth. I was actually talking to a respiratory diseases specialist the other day. He's my sleep doctor, I guess. And I asked him what he thought about this, and he said one of the nastiest bugs that the world has ever seen. And chloroquine has very little evidence that the scientists truly rate highly. What they are saying, though, is that the medical technology now is better than ever before, and we're going to be seeing an unprecedented response in terms of getting an anti-vaccine or a viral therapy out there. So we really, in a good world, we might see a very positive outcome here before Christmas. It could take longer though, so this will come behind us. Looking at the stock market, we've seen a few days of very positive story in the last week. markets. If you're looking at the All Ordinaries is up to 56.72. That's 1,000 point up somewhere, 1,000 points up on where it was a few weeks ago. So this is a very positive story. The market is factoring in a rebound and a return to economic stability fairly quickly. As I said, this will be a continuing good story while ever we're seeing a recovery in the numbers from COVID-19. But we're going to see some figures popping out in 6 months' time that are going to be negative, and they will affect where the stock market's at. So don't expect this to be just an unbounded recovery going forward. Again, I've shown you these figures in the past, so I won't revisit it now. The notion of me saying it should do this and it should do that by Christmas and it should do this by the following mid-year, the numbers are very, very clear when you look at 20, 30, 40 years of history. The fool that thinks he can pick where the market's going to be on any given day is soon broke. The markets have a rhythm and a timing to them. They do eventually, or they do inevitably go up 53 or 54% of the time, which gives you on average 4 good years out of 5. And any attempt to pick when the good year is going to be or the bad year is going to be results in you missing out on the good years. So we're very much of the opinion that we're going to manage your portfolio so that you don't have to touch the growth side of your investments for 2 years, 3 years. And we think, and we have a high degree of confidence that this is going to mean the portfolios do well. So if we're looking at the 12-month story, it absolutely went from 7,000 and change. It collapsed down to about 4,600. But we're seeing, as we always do for these kind of catastrophic falls, a very rapid recovery because they always go too far. And the suggestion is going to be that it should plateau. My gut instinct is going to plateau around where it is, between 5,700, 5,500 and maybe 7,000 for the next 6 months or 12 months. And then we're going to start to see a recovery there. Notwithstanding the fact that you're going to be receiving dividends and benefits out of owning the shares, it's not all about the share price. In fact, 2/3 of the returns you get out of your portfolio with us will come from income from the shares, which are going to be suppressed this year, but should return next year fairly strongly. Okay, so let's have a quick chat about China and Australia, because this is really the only story in the newspaper at the moment. I'm going to touch on the COVID-19 investigation. I want to do a very quick macroeconomic analysis of why China's not going to take over the world. They don't want to. The last time that happened was in Japan, and that ended with an atomic bomb in 1945, and that's the last major imperialist advance in the Western Pacific area. The Russians tried it again following World War II, and that collapsed in the 80s. Imperialism is an interesting conversation. We're going to look at trade, investment, we're going to look at the amount of land that the Chinese own in Australia and the impact on politics and tourism. I think in the end, there's going to be a very positive story here. What you've got to do is not fall for the elephants mating thing. You know, the old joke about elephants mating is there's a lot of screaming and noise. It's all happening at a very high level, and it's down underneath where the little guy gets trampled. So just hang in there with me. I hope this makes sense. This is just to talk about what's in the newspaper today. Australia was the first country in the world to demand, promote an independent investigation of China's handling of the COVID-19 problem, where it came from, how it was transmitted, and what health outcomes could have or should have been taken to mitigate what happened. China initially opposed it because that's what China does. You're not allowed to criticise us, and they attacked Australia for promoting it. On Monday night, the World Health Organization Forum, called the World Health Assembly, had somewhere, but it depends on which report you look at, between 110 and 120 countries backed the call for an independent investigation. It was led by the European Union. Last night, 130 countries, including China, supported the notion of an investigation led by the WHO, or the World Health Organization. China claims what I'm now calling the hoo-ha resolution is very different to Australia's inappropriate investigation. I don't think Australia gives a damn. I think Australia wants to know how this happened and who is responsible and what we can learn from it. China, I think, is very much trying to save face. So The Hoo-ha resolution has been passed. It was passed last night. I'm sure China is going to be obstructive and problematic in the way they do it, but it would appear that there's a lot of pressure now internationally, as there should be, for a genuine understanding of what happened here. For those that haven't been reading the conspiracy theory sort of things, China's argument was that this disease came from a bat in what's called a wet market, which is like the fish markets in Australia, where you can buy raw food live in front of you. But there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that this may have come from a lab in Wuhan, which no one's suggesting that it was deliberately released. In fact, that would be rather stupid for China to do that, so I don't think that's even suggested. It's just that it may have been clumsy. So what I wanted to do before we get too excited, though, is to talk about why this isn't why China's behaviour here is not going to be motivated by creating. They're not trying to take over the world. They're trying to rule it economically. So if we look here, if we go back from, I might just pause this here. I'm looking at the economic growth of some major countries around the world since the 1800s. Australia, China, Russia, United States, and the United Kingdom. Now, initially here, we're seeing Australia growing really quickly, and for a period there, let me just try to get it here, Australia was the most wealthy nation in the world. And the reason we were was after we got through our initial period, we're trying to establish a colony, we started to export food, we started to grow in value, we started to trade, mainly with the United Kingdom, but that trade made us very wealthy as a nation. The rest of the world, United Kingdom, United States, Russia and China, was very much imperialist. These days, in these days, wealth was associated with owning the raw materials, the gold, the food, the mining and all those sort of things. It wasn't associated with trade. Australia was one of the first nations in the world to realise that if you create trade with other countries, you can make a lot of money. So now as we progress through this period here, you see that the rest of the world gradually figures out through the 1900s and through the world wars that, whoops, I managed to screw that up. The rest of the world figures out that if you start to trade with each other and have stable diplomatic and economic ties with each other, your wealth as a nation improves, your economic outcomes improve, and generally everybody's happy with you and you get to stay in power. Where it gets interesting is it wasn't until about the 1980s, come back here a little, that China figured this out. After Mao and his Great Leap Forward basically failed, they said we need another path. And that path, particularly into the 90s, which is a whole Tiananmen Square thing, is when they opened China up, and this happened. Suddenly China realised that its best interest was served by economic growth, not by dominating resources. So the old model of just conquer the world and you'll get to be wealthy, that's true when resources are scarce, but the whole thrust of capitalism is that trading makes you rich, not owning a gold mine. Now that's quite a powerful statement when you look at China's behaviour. So in 2019, Chinese trade rose to 36% of Australia's export. There's no doubt about it. They're our most important trading partner, and we need them and they need us. Yet at the same time, as China's trade was rising with Australia, our trade with them was dropping. It's a curious thing. The two-way trade at the moment is up 20% year on year for the last financial year. It's $235 billion. The GDP around the world, and this is a fascinating one, when you're looking at the first quarter of the year, US was down 5%, Japan down 3.4%, China down 6.4%, which is a monster figure. Yet, curiously enough, in that period, the Australian exports to China grew by 4.3%. So what's going on here is not that we are selling stuff to China, is they are buying it. They're buying it because we are the best provider of iron ore, gas, coal, food, where Australia is considered green and clean. They want what we have because we are politically stable, economically stable, and the most reliable provider of all these raw materials to China in the world. I'll look at the alternative suppliers like Uruguay and Brazil and so forth in a minute, but they suffer immensely by comparison to Australia in terms of reliability. So the World Trade Organization is an interesting one because, again, don't listen to the elephants screaming. We've got to figure out what's going on here. China has realized that its future depends on dominating the world economically by being the biggest trading nation in the world, not by being the biggest imperialist nation in the world. They were never very successful trying to form armies and navies and dominate the world, which is why they haven't invaded Taiwan. It's why they never successfully invaded Japan. They never actually succeeded very well with their army and their navy. So they've realized that the economy is the way to greatness. So to trade with the rest of the world, China needs to follow the world's rules. Those rules are established in the World Trade Organization. Don't worry about the temporary application of sanctions and things like that. Those sanctions will be examined in the WTO, and China has a really strong need to be considered a good member of the World Trade Organization, notwithstanding, I think, what we can all acknowledge are fairly strong bully boy tactics. So they often do a whole bunch of squawking, they threaten economically, but they don't tend to follow through as much as the media would have you believe. So if we're going to look at barley, what's actually happened here, and I couldn't find any evidence for this, China has completed an 18-month investigation into Australia selling barley for less than cost of production over the last 10 years. I couldn't find any evidence for this one way or the other. Australia says no, but China has in fact been investigating this for almost 18 months. So this is not a completely trumped up thing. This was something that was underway that they grabbed and used as a punishment for Scott Morrison supporting the COVID-19 investigation. The concept of dumping is manipulating the market, destroying other people's competitiveness by selling stuff cheap. Now, China's been investigated many times for dumping. This is, in fact, the first time that they've ever investigated us. So the barley trade, now barley is necessary for food and for grain and things like that with their domestic animals and their pigs and cattle and things. $600 million annual trade with China. They've applied an 80.5% tariff, and it's not going to be nice. It's going to hurt. There's no question about it. As I said, Australia's launched many anti-dumping cases against China, so it's not like this is unprecedented. And again, don't listen to the noise, look at the actions. Australia is taking the matter to the World Trade Organization, and it will be resolved because China respects the WTO. Doesn't matter what they say, they historically want to be considered a good member of it, so they get the trading opportunities that come from it. Because remember, if it breaks down, they don't get to sell things, and they need to sell things. Let's just quickly talk about beef. They've applied tariffs on 4 or 5 Australian abattoirs. Again, this is a threat more than it is an economic problem at the moment. The reason they've done this is because we export a lot of beef. Right? Chinese demand for beef has been tipped to continue growing. It's been growing at 20% a year since 2012. The reality is that the better the quality of food you eat, the better your nation's health outcomes are. So the protein from beef is one of the highest density food sources in the world, and the Chinese just love it. We export 80% of our beef. A large percentage of it goes to China, and it grew by 40% by comparison to the preceding year. So if you're just looking at not last year, the year before, we're exporting something like 1 million tons of cow, which is a rather lot by comparison to 700,000 tons in the previous few years. Our biggest competitors in the world at the moment are Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Canada, and US. Okay, Brazil is in a mess because COVID-19 is really stuffing them up. They've had all sorts of problems in their actual domestic beef industry, and there's problems with their health and safety records as well. Uruguay, again, a relatively small supply by comparison to Australia. Argentina is another strong beef nation. They're having lots of difficulty. Their reliability is not good. They can't get the food to China as quick as they can. Canada and America are on our side in this thing against China. So they're not China's friends if you look at the rhetoric in the newspapers as well. So Canada and America and Australia are part of what's called the Five Eyes Network. And that's US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And those particular countries are really strong in holding China to account as good corporate citizens. So I guess what I'm saying is China can't really find another source for their beef needs at the moment. Now, they can certainly buy more from these other countries, but there's some real problems with those South American countries supplying food. And Canada and the US are on our side against China, if you're going to call it a side. Nobody really wants to fight, but China needs Australia very much here because they need the beef, right? And it will cause, remembering that all politics is domestic, right? That it always looks good when your leaders are picking fights with other countries, but it doesn't look good when your leaders' decisions mean that you can't get food for your family. So there's a limited window here where China has to continue to do the right thing by its people. If we look at iron ore, it's a critical export to China, a billion tonnes in 2019. 62% of all China's iron ore comes from Australia. We have the best iron ore in the world. That's the closest source of iron ore to China. We're the most politically reliable. We're the most dependable. It's all good. 21% of it comes from Brazil. As I said earlier, Brazil's got problems with COVID-19. It's got weather problems, got safety shutdowns. The Brazilian iron ore industry is struggling, relatively speaking, by comparison to was it Twiggy Forrest and Fortescue Metals in Rio and BHP in Australia. So again, even if China wanted to get iron ore from Brazil, they actually can't get the reliable iron ore supply they need. Chinese steel production increased strongly in March. So I've made these comments before that if you really want to get a sense of what's going to happen in terms of economic outcome, look at the inputs to the economic outcome. And I've got some figures that I'll show you in a second that talk about how important steel is to everything China does. So Chinese economic recovery will start with an internal expansion because external trade is limited at the moment. So China is going to do it again. They're going to build roads and bridges and cities and dams, and they need steel for all of that, along with cement. So if we look here, and I didn't animate this slide, but forgive me. If you look at China's top 10 exports all around the world, right? 27% of it comes from electrical machinery and equipment. Different other types of machinery, 17%, furniture, bedding, vehicles, optical machinery, general iron and steel sort of needs. 56% of everything that China sells needs steel. 61% of all the steel that China makes comes from Australia. The other major supplier, being Brazil, is having trouble at the moment with their domestic economy and their iron ore production at the moment. China, it doesn't matter what they say, China has no choice about who they deal with. If they want to restore their country to economic growth, they need energy, coal, and steel and cement. There's only really one place for them to get it. So they'll smack us on the wrist with barley, and they'll close or make imports difficult from 4 or 5 different abattoirs. But again, don't look on the surface of it. This is a spat between two people that need to get along. This is not something fundamentally challenging, because not that China's not capable of going elsewhere, they are, but they just don't really have a choice at the moment. Because remembering that the US doesn't export iron ore, it does export beef, but the US is having trouble with China at the moment, along with Australia and Canada. So we're in a really strong position here. They need us a lot. Otherwise, they're going to choke their economic growth. So other interesting figures here, if you look at the expansion in trade between Australia and China, Australian exports going to China is around the 38%. It's the blue bar. It's been growing for the last 5 or 6 years. The share of Chinese imports, believe it or not, hasn't actually grown that much. Despite our economic growth, we're not necessarily buying everything from China. We're getting it from other parts of the world. So there's a slight inequity here, and it's because China needs us. We can buy cars and oil and a lot of things from a lot of different places. China needs what we have slightly more than we need what they have. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be mindful of that and continue to have a good trading relationship with China. We should. But they need us a lot because they can't manufacture the stuff they need to manufacture without us. So this is not quite the negative story that it looks like. Now, I just wanted to look at some other figures in relation to China, because I found this quite interesting when I'm digging around. This is going back a couple of years, but it's hard to get this data. This is foreign ownership of Australian land. It's not Chinese ownership, it's foreign ownership. The total ownership of Australia's pastoral land, 13.6%. right? It's really interesting to see where the majority of that ownership is happening. In this case, it's in the mining and the food production districts, West Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland, to a certain extent, South Australia. A little bit in New South Wales because there's mining out west and so forth. But we're seeing an awful lot of the interest of foreign countries in this country relate to raw materials and rural production. So if we have a look at the agricultural land, which is something that is in the media all the time, some of this comes from sort of Bob Katter's party and so forth, China actually owns 9 million hectares. The biggest owner of Australian land is the UK still. And after that, the long distance, the third is the USA, and believe it or not, the Dutch. Right? Now, I'm guessing the Bahamas there are companies that are situated in the Bahamas. Who knows what the ownership of those countries are? Then we see a really interesting little mix of Canada. Canada is a very similar country, Switzerland, Hong Kong being China, right? And you could add the Hong Kong interest into there, and it comes up to about equal with the UK, Philippines, Saudi Arabia. That's horse studs, I'm sure. Singapore and South Africa. But the real interest here is China is not quite the #1 foreign agricultural country in the world, but when you add Hong Kong in, they are. Now, when you look at what people are using the land for, and again, this comes from Bob Katter's sort of party, 87% or 88% of all the land owned by other countries in this country, what they're in it for is food. It's as simple as that. You know, the food industry in this country has got a really positive outlook. This is one of those interesting things where you talk about what happens if the population of the world keeps growing. Well, we're at 7 billion now. All the good mathematics says we're not going to go much past 9 billion in about 30 years' time. And the reason we're not going to go past 9 billion is we're getting richer. As countries around the world get richer, they literally stop having children. It's as simple as that. So if you go to Italy right now, for every 2 people that get married, they make 1.8 children or 1.7 children. So literally the population of countries is shrinking. The wealthier they get, the more they shrink, right? And in Australia's case, and I've mentioned this before, the population is being topped up, if you will, by immigration. And this effect is happening all over the world where the younger people, the families, the younger people coming in their 30s and 40s, a lot of them are from Muslim countries and African countries, but they still want food. They literally want food. Europe wants food. China wants food. Australia wants food. Everybody needs food. And Australia is one of the best food growing areas in the world, not just because of our climate. Climate's okay, notwithstanding fires and floods and droughts, but it's the economic and the political stability associated with this country that they all crave. You could get food from South Africa, very similar climate, nowhere near as reliable. You could get food from Brazil, very similar climate, nowhere near as reliable. Likewise, other South American countries. Right? What we have, and this is the same thing America has, even China, for example, Canada, very good economically and politically, but their climate is not as friendly as ours. So when you start hunting around the world, this combination of great climate, great economy, great political stability, there's actually only a handful of countries that can do this. And we are one of the best in the world, and they will be buying our food for the rest of our lives. So that's a very positive story when you look at it. Now, another interesting story when you look at water rights. Right? Water is another proxy for economic growth associated with agriculture. So again, at the moment, China owns more of Australia's water than anyone else. Looking at the US, UK and Canada, all of these are agricultural interests in our nation. The French, curiously, I didn't put any emphasis on this, but the French are actually deliberately buying water all around the world because they see it as a scarce resource like gold. And it's going to be an interesting trade over the next few years if global warming comes to be an issue and so forth. It's just a fascinating story when you look at what's going on. They may be buying our houses to a certain extent. What they're really doing, and this is not necessarily evil, it's prudent. The Chinese are buying raw materials, as in iron ore, mining businesses and mining leases, and they're buying food. Why? Because they want to know that they can secure their own critical resource supply to their nation. And that's not wrong because they're paying full market fare for it. I don't particularly like some of the tactics that the Chinese use, because they're certainly good at serving their own needs and then accusing people of being self-serving when they don't like what's coming at them, which is certainly what's going on right now. But the Chinese interest in Australia is not imperialist. The Chinese interest is associated with securing the economic growth in their country. And that's a motivation, by and large, I think we can trust. So just finally, looking at a couple of other things, 16% of every tourism dollar that comes to this country is Chinese. 38% of all foreign education income, these are the Chinese students at universities, 12 billion. There are a bunch of political scandals going on at the moment. I don't know if you remember, but there's a Chinese Australian guy that was very closely associated with government businesses in Victoria. Gladys Liu was a Liberal politician that was associated with the Chinese. Sam Dastyari was a Labor politician that was taking a lot of money from the Chinese, and they're all being thrown out. This goes back 2 or 3 years ago to when Malcolm Turnbull was in charge, and a lot of these things are coming out. The bit that I find really interesting is the media never talks about this. They want the headline, they don't want the detail. But there is absolutely pressure from the Australian government for the Chinese to get out of our politics, and the Chinese don't like being told. Now, there's something that you may want to look up called the Confucius Classroom and the Confucius Institute. We have something, I believe, in the order of 13 separate schools in the state school system where the Chinese have sponsored education programs in the schools. The state government has recently terminated that program, and it'll all be done by the end of this year. They found that the Chinese were basically promoting a particular view that the state government wasn't comfortable with. The Confucius Institutes are organisations within our universities to promote the Chinese perspective on things. There are several countries in Europe that have just banned these institutes. So there is a lot of tension in this space at the moment. You've got to listen closely to what the media says. It's normally in the last 5 words of things that they're saying. They don't want to talk about the detail here, but there is no doubt China is trying very much to secure political and economic allegiance out of its trading partners so that it can protect its own interests. The interesting piece is America's way of doing it, as much as I'm not always a fan of the American agenda, is a lot more transparent and open than perhaps the Chinese. So we've had a variety of scandals, if you will, where the Chinese have attempted to buy a stake in Ausgrid or the Kidman company or the natural gas company, in the Huawei mobile phone network was banned from having 5G mobile phones in Australia. All of this is the government saying, no, this is our turf, you don't just get to come in and own it. And that's the source, this slide, is the source of the real tension between ScoMo and China at the moment. It's not about the COVID-19 thing. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the background where the Chinese influence has been pushed back on by the Australians, and the COVID-19 investigation is simply the straw that's breaking the camel's back. Remembering, however, that they need us. So China versus Australia, they need our food, they need our iron ore, our energy, our coal. Our coal's the best coal in the world. It's the cheapest and easiest to get there, and it's the most reliable. The world market is not oversupplied with these resources because they don't just dig this stuff out of the ground and stick it in the stockpile hoping that the Chinese are going to buy it. It takes years to change trading relationships from Australia to Brazil. And Brazil and South Africa and India, these suppliers of alternative resources are nowhere near as reliable as Australia. China needs trade as much as we do and obeys the World Trade Organization. I just want to finish on this because it's certainly starting to go out in the social media and on the TV. I don't think there's any great conspiracy here with China. I don't think anyone is accusing them of deliberately releasing this virus. I think there seems to be a bit of evidence to say they were experimenting with something like this and it may have got out. It doesn't matter. I don't think they did it deliberately. And certainly, and this is important, and this one came out on a silly thing I saw last night, I don't think China has any interest in damaging the economies of other countries. They don't want that. They want us vibrant and rich, so we'll buy things from them. The last major expansion of imperialism was the Soviet bloc after World War II. It just failed miserably. The one before that started in Japan in the 1880s, when the Japanese went from being a closed country to modeling themselves on the Americans and the Europeans. And that was phenomenally successful until the Americans said to them at the beginning of World War I, stop doing this. And it took 20 or 30 years for the Japanese to wind down their particular agenda, but it ended very badly. The Japanese then reinvented themselves from an imperialist economy to a free market or a capitalist economy, and it's been very successful for them. The Chinese have tried many things over the centuries. The one thing that has worked is not to go and grab other people's resources, is to go and trade with other people. So there is nothing to suggest, in my mind, that anyone benefits from damaging the economies of other countries. What they're trying to do is to dominate, right, and to secure their own resources. And I understand that, but we're allowed to say, no, thank you, right? And there's a very strong allegiance at the moment between America, Canada, New Zealand, UK and Australia. It's called the Five Eyes Network. Go digging if you will. But essentially there's a push and shove contest going on at the moment. I think we all knew that. The Chinese are trying to do what they're trying to do in the South China Sea. But that's really to get economic dominance of the world, not to try to get military dominance of the world. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I'm just looking to see whether anyone's got any questions. We're still tuning in, so I'm not seeing any questions coming. Let me just look at the chat box here. No one's asked anything at this point, so I might just finish up. As I said, educated people know facts. It's what you do with those facts that make you successful. So I'm trying very hard in these sessions, to give you the information, but also to give you the backstory, to understand what's going on. And again, today's conversation was, yep, China are a bit of a thug at times, but they're not trying to hurt us. They actually want security for their own agenda, which is not unlike what capitalism is the whole world around. So I think longer term, we're in a pretty good shape here. The Australian government is resisting Chinese influence, and I think that's going to work itself out quite nicely. Again, we're all here waiting. My girls are going back to school next week, which means I'm going to be missing them, but we're finding that our offices are gradually getting more and more people in for a variety of reasons. Please continue to call us if you've got any questions. I note that a lot of you have actually become very comfortable with phone reviews and Zoom reviews, so we're going to try to bring that more and more into our process, which is good for those that live further away. But to be honest, nothing beats belly to belly. I do miss talking with clients face to face. Although to be honest, I don't miss wearing a suit and tie. All right, so from my perspective, guys, I hope that's been valuable. If anybody, Shirley, put a picture up there, I'm not sure what that's about, but if any of you have any questions, raise your hand now. But I have enjoyed speaking with you again today, and we will release this video for viewing again in a few days' time. And until next week, take care, God bless, and be safe. Bye now.